Greetings everyone, this is A.M.O.P.S, and this is the Chronicles of A.M.O.P.S, and this is the fourth video of a month of positive solutions called Peace in the Middle East. As you know, this is nearing the end of what I've declared to be a month of positive solutions. And today's particular topic is going to be peace in the Middle East. Now, this is going to be coming from my experience in actually living in the Middle East, not just someone who's talking about something outside of the land, but actually someone who's actually in it. So for decades, the Western world has believed that it can bring peace to the Middle East. And the question is, can peace be really achieved, especially through the means of the West? So one of the things that I look at is the two sides of the coin. You know, there's a solution that comes from people who live in the Middle East, and there's things that people who live outside can do. So as I do with all the videos, we have to discuss what the issues are. So you can see listed here, the West's involvement in the Middle East has been basically something that hasn't helped the situation here. And basically in terms of the background and the issues, you have to go back several thousand years to really understand the issues. And what you're looking at is European colonization as well as the clash of cultures. So what you're looking at now is a list of the foreign occupiers who have been occupying this region for the last 2,000 years, starting with the Roman Empire and ending with the British rule. Before I get into the British rule aspect of it, I want to get into the second to last one, being the Ottoman Empire, which was basically a Turkish foreign occupier in this region. As you can see, this is the extent that the Ottoman Empire got to. And, basically, once again, they were a foreign occupier of not only this region in the Middle East, but also parts of Africa and into like parts of Europe. So, getting to the point after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, basically during the two world wars, now you see the occupation that took place from the European, nations that were there, as well as the Ottomans in this region. And you notice you don't see an Israel, you don't see a Palestine. So neither country was in existence during this time. So when we start looking at European colonization, we have to go to the very beginning of what do we know about it. We know that during Napoleon's time that there was a number of attempts to basically colonize this area, and eventually the British, would take Egypt and Sudan and the small states of the Persian Gulf, and also France. So we see now with the sources who the major players were. So one of the things we have to look at is when the French and the British were able to get their hands on this region, one of the things they immediately started doing amongst themselves was basically splitting it up. So when you look, this particular map is something that was taking place around the time of about World War II or so, World War I, World War II. And, between those times and after those times, there was a particular agreement that the British and the French came to try to have these secret meetings called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they were going to basically carve up the Middle East and decide what they wanted to keep, who they wanted to give what to, and what allowed them to have the most advantage in the region in terms of financial control as well as political control. So this is very important when you start talking about the Middle East, because without discussing this, you're discussing nothing. So it's important to look at some of the back table, under the table dealings that were going on. And one of the things, if you notice in the 1922 Churchill White Paper, was that they were making a number of promises to a number of different groups. There are people who claim that they were making promises just to the Zionists, blah, 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 but they were making promises to like Arab nations and Zionists, and a lot of the promises they were making were contradictory. And, basically you can read through this particular white paper and see the things that they were talking about doing to the region. In order to understand what they wanted from the region, Lawrence of Arabia wrote in 1916 concerning this issue that if they could basically get rid of the Ottomans, support certain Arab groups, they could keep them kind of at each other's throats by supporting the Arabs rather than the Ottomans. And the basic issue was to be able to have British control over the region. So this is being discussed as early as 1916. And this is, once again, not about giving control to one group, but basically have a number of groups at each other's throats in the Middle East. And that was what would have been most advantageous to the British government during that time. So when I look at the solutions to this, basically what I'm looking at is that the Western world needs to cut off money to this region. It needs to back out of this region with the arms and the weapons it's giving, and people in the Middle East need to solve their own problems, period. So basically when this issue comes up, there's two sides to it. There's an anti-Israel position with the points that you see listed where there's like this secret Zionist global conspiracy that everybody seems to know about. On the other side of it is there are people who have the anti-Arab points where the United States involvement in the Middle East revolves around the need for Middle East oil, as well as Saudi Arabian lobbies controlling secretly various U.S. institutions, and the U.S. having historically provided finances to extremist groups, and then those groups changing over. So when we start looking at the money trail, I have a number of slides that I'm going to be presenting that comes from the USAID.gov website, where it talks about the money they give to the region. Now, when you look at this slide, it talks about money that they give to Israel initially, which is pretty much up there in the $2 billion range. But specifically, this money is so that Israel can buy back from America, as well as pay off its debts from America. So when we start looking at the money, it's kind of like there's several things that don't make any sense. The U.S. gives Israel money to pay off a debt that Israel already owes to the U.S., and then the U.S. gives money in order for us to buy American. Which, once again, why do you give money to have someone pay off a debt they already owe you? And why give money so that they can buy from you? And this includes weapons. This is why most of Israel's weapons are American, because of the fact that this money that they get is to be able to make them buy American. So the obvious question is, how do you give money to a country in order to pay off a debt they already owe, like I said before? So then the next thing we have to look at is the next part of the money trail. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has traditionally been the most important U.S. ally in the Arab and Islamic world. But when you start looking at some of its issues, there's a number of issues in terms of its monarchy being protected by the United States and basically having this deal of cheap oil to subsidize the U.S. arms industry with major weapons purchases. The next part of the money trail is that Egypt is the second largest recipient of U.S. military aid, while Saudi Arabia is the #1 buyer of U.S. arms. Almost none of the dozens of successful transitions into democracy in recent decades have come from foreign intervention. So these are important points to actually look at when you start looking at this process of Middle East peace involving the West. So then the next part of the money trail is that when you start looking at during the administration of Reagan, there was a lot of support for certain Saudi National Guard groups that were in the Saudi Arabia to basically control the region and provide connections to various political powers. So once again, with this, you don't have to believe me, but you can start looking at what a politician named Ron Paul basically said about this whole issue.
Congressman Paul, can we go back to the Middle East? You have said the United States should not be trying to broker peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Should the president even be there today, sir?
Well, if you followed my advice, yes, we wouldn't be there. We've been doing that for a good many years, and it hasn't seemed to come to success. No, I think if we weren't there, there'd be more incentives to come to a peaceful agreement. But we support both sides, not only with the Palestinians, but the Lebanese and all the Arab nations. We support Israel, and we try to have this balance. But I think it'd be much better to have a balance by being out of there. And I think there would be a greater incentive for Israel and the Palestinian and all the Arab nations to come together and talk, because I think we get in the way too often of these. And besides, it's costing us a lot of money. It's costing us lives now. And it's time that we come to the point where we believe the world can solve some of their problems without us. And also, we're out of money. We can't do it any longer. We're going bankrupt. And the empires of the world have always ended badly through economic terms. So whether there are peace agreements over there, for instance, if we would stop all aids over there, we would stop 3 times as much aid as Israel gets to the Arab nations. Why do we arm the Arab nations? And they're the enemies of Israel. But we continue to do that. So why don't we trade with everybody and talk with them? And there's a greater incentive to work these problems out. I think if we'd have been out of there a lot sooner, there may well have been a much different settlement after the Kuwait invasion, because Israel was quite capable of working with moderate Arab nations. They tried to. None of the Arab nations wanted Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. And I think they could have taken care of Saddam Hussein back then and saved all the mess that we have now, because I think there are so many unintended consequences and way too much blowback. In many ways, we treat Israel as a stepchild. We do not give them the responsibility that they deserve. We undermine their national sovereignty. We don't let them design their own peace treaties with their neighbors. And then we turn around and say that when you want to do that, or you want to defend your borders, they have to check it out with us. I think Israel would be a lot safer. I made the point earlier. We give 3 times as much money to the Arabs. Why do we arm their enemies? So if you care about Israel, you should be against all the weapons that go to the Arab nations. And I just don't see any purpose in not treating Israel in an adult fashion. I think they'd be a lot better off. I think they one time in the 80s took care of a nuclear reactor in Iraq. I stood up and defended Israel for this. Nobody else did at that time. But we need to recognize they deserve their sovereignty just as we deserve our sovereignty. I believe that they assume more responsibility, there would be more peace there, and that there would be a lot less threat to us. Besides, we don't have any money to...
Now, it must be noted that Ron Paul is not on any kind of Jewish or Israeli payroll. He is definitely against a lot of things in Israel that exist right now. So I believe that peace can be achieved, but I believe it can only be achieved when America, Europe, and Russia backs out of this region and starts pushing keeping their initiatives to themselves and let people who live here actually solve our own problems. Basically, Middle Eastern style peace can be that we either solve our problems through peaceful means over coffee and nargila, or we'll solve it through war. But one way or the other, it's up to people who live in the Middle East and have dedicated themselves to living here to solve our own problems, and not the West, and not Europe, and not Russia. So this is a however a month of positive solutions, this being the last solution.